First, let's look at the anatomy of the back muscles. The back is actually a group of many different individual muscles. We can subcategorize the back muscles into three primary groups: the upper back, the lats, and the spinal erectors. First, let's look at the upper back region. This encompasses the muscles of the trapezius, the posterior deltoids, the infraspinatus, and the rhomboids, which sit underneath the trapezius. These muscles all have similar functions, which is why they are typically collectively referred to as the upper back. In terms of their anatomy, the trapezius inserts on the clavicle or collarbone and the scapula or shoulder blade, and it originates primarily along the upper half of the spine. The posterior deltoid, or rear delts for short, inserts on the humerus or upper arm bone, and it originates on the scapula. Like the rear delts, the infraspinatus also inserts on the humerus and originates on the scapula. And the last upper back muscle, the rhomboids, inserts on the scapula and originates on the spine. Next, let's look at the lats. The lats refer mainly to a single muscle, the latissimus dorsi. But we can also include the teres major and teres minor muscles when referring to the lats too. The lat muscles have slightly different primary functions to the upper back, which is why we are subcategorizing it. In terms of its anatomy, the latissimus dorsi inserts on the humerus. It originates at a few different points, mainly the lower half of the spine, lower 3 to 4 ribs, and into the fascia of the lower back, which indirectly connects the lats to the spine and pelvis. Both the teres muscles have similar anatomy. They both insert on the humerus, and they both originate on the scapula. Moving on to the spinal erectors, these are a group of muscles known as the erector spinae, which run along the sides of the spine underneath most of the other back muscles. Again, the spinal erectors have slightly different primary functions to the other back regions, which is why we are subcategorizing it. In terms of its anatomy, the various erector spinae muscles all insert and originate at various points along the spine and ribs, and also attach to the top of the pelvis and the bottom of the skull. Now that we have explored the anatomy of the back, let's look at what functions the back muscle contributes to. As mentioned, the different regions of the back contribute to slightly different primary functions. The upper back muscles have two primary roles. First is to retract the scapula. This is the movement of squeezing the shoulder blades back and together. The other primary role is to horizontally extend the shoulder. This is the movement of bringing the arm backward in a horizontal motion. Moving on to the lats, these muscles also have two primary functions. First is extension of the shoulder. This is the movement of bringing the arm down from in front of the body. The other primary function is shoulder adduction. This is the movement of bringing the arm down from the side of our body. And the spinal erectors only have one primary function, and this is spinal extension, as the name implies. This is the movement of arching the spine from a rounded position. With these functions in mind, let's now explore what exercises are going to be effective for training the back muscles. There are three general categories of exercises which can train the various back muscles. First are rows. This includes any form of rows such as barbell rows, seated cable rows, dumbbell rows, chest-supported rows, and so on. Rows are going to train all the back muscles to some extent. Although, based on our understanding of anatomy, rows are going to be most effective for targeting the upper back muscles. This is because they primarily involve scapular retraction and shoulder horizontal extension. The second category of back exercises are vertical pulls. This refers to any form of vertical pulling exercises such as lat pull-downs, pull-up and chin-up variants, and lat pullovers. Most vertical pulls will also train all the back muscles to some extent. Although based on anatomy knowledge, these exercises are likely to bias the lats. This is because they primarily involve the movements of shoulder extension and/or shoulder adduction. They also take the lats through a greater range of motion compared with rows. And the third category of back exercises are back extensions. This refers to a small range of exercises which safely involve spinal extension, such as hyperextensions, reverse hyperextensions, and variants of the glute ham raise machine. Because these exercises involve spinal extension as the primary movement, they are going to mostly train the spinal erectors. As mentioned, pretty much any row or vertical pull variation will train the upper back, lats, and spinal erectors to some extent. It is more so that these exercise categories can bias certain regions of the back over others. Next, let's move on to some exercise setup and technique considerations to maximize back development. Before discussing these, it should be noted that the scientific evidence directly assessing back hypertrophy is extremely limited. Therefore, we are mostly relying on functional anatomy knowledge and muscle activation evidence to make these inferences. But based on what we can infer, here are a few setup and technique considerations relevant for back training. The first is for our scapular movement, specifically during rows. As discussed, scapular retraction is one of the primary roles of the upper back muscles. So when we perform a row, we probably want to actively focus on squeezing our shoulder blades back and together. And when lowering the weight, we should then allow the shoulder blades to protract or round forward to maximally stretch the upper back muscles. To retract your scapula, think about trying to pinch a pencil between your shoulder blades and push your chest out. To protract your shoulder blades, think about allowing your shoulders to round forward without flexing your spine or moving at the hips, feeling the stretch in the muscles between your shoulder blades. This scapular movement will naturally occur during rows whether we actively focus on it or not, but we may want to emphasize this movement to maximize the involvement of the upper back muscles. This study compared the effects of performing seated cable rows with or without active scapular retraction. It was found that muscle activity of the lats and middle trapezius were a little greater when actively focusing on scapular retraction. The next setup and technique consideration is for the grip used during back training. Many back exercises can be performed with overhand, underhand, neutral, narrow, or wide grips. But do these grips influence which specific back muscles are trained? And if so, which grip should we use for each exercise? In most cases, the specific grip used doesn't seem to have any major influence on which back muscles are trained. For example, this study compared the effects of performing lat pull-downs with either a narrow, medium, or wide grip on back muscle activity. It was found that activity of all back muscles measured were similar, regardless of grip width. Another study compared the effects of performing seated cable rows with either an overhand, underhand, or neutral grip on back muscle activity. Again, it was found that muscle activity of the traps, lats, and rear delts were similar between the different grip positions. So from the evidence we have, there doesn't seem to be a major difference in muscle activity of the back muscles when training with different grips. As long as the back is what limits performance of the set, any grip type is going to be effective for back muscle growth, so it's not something to stress too much about. Next, let's look at another technique consideration, and that is our elbow position during back exercises. While our specific grip doesn't seem to have a major influence on activity of the back muscles, we may be able to slightly bias some back muscles over others by lifting through different planes of motion. Based on functional anatomy, it seems that we would likely bias the lats to a greater extent by performing rows or vertical pulls with the elbows more tucked in, while the upper back is likely to be biased a little more by lifting with a more flared out elbow position. For example, performing a neutral grip pull down may train the lats to a slightly greater extent compared with a wide grip pull down, whereas a row performed with a high elbow position is likely to maximize involvement of the upper back and to reduce involvement of the lats. There is also some muscle activity research which confirms this, such as this study which looked at the effects of performing seated cable rows with various degrees of elbow flare. Here it was found that the upper traps, middle traps, and posterior deltoids saw greater muscle activity with increasing degrees of elbow flare, whereas the upper and lower lats saw greater muscle activity with less elbow flare. This suggests that to bias the upper back muscles, it may be beneficial to perform rows and vertical pulls with a more flared out elbow position, and to bias the lats, we may want to lift with a more tucked in elbow position. The next technique consideration for back training is the use of lengthened partials. Most rows and vertical pulls naturally have a fairly poor resistance profile. This is because the easiest part of the exercise is the lengthened range, when our arms are furthest away from our body. and the most challenging part of the exercise is the shortened range, when our arms are closest to our body. What this means is that even when training to failure during many back exercises, we are usually able to perform more reps with a partial range of motion. For example, once we reach failure during a set of rows with all reps touching our body, we can likely perform a few extra partial reps by performing only 3/4 of the range of motion. And lengthened partials seem to be just as, if not more effective for muscle growth compared with full range of motion reps. This was established in this meta-analysis, which compared the effects of full versus partial range of motion resistance training on muscle growth. It was found that overall, full range of motion seems to be marginally favorable for hypertrophy compared with partial range. However, when partials are performed in the lengthened position, the evidence tends to find slightly superior growth using partial range of motion training. So by performing post-failure lengthened partials, we are able to achieve more reps each set in the most effective range of the exercise. This is likely to improve the hypertrophic stimulus of each set to a small magnitude. The next technique consideration is for back extension exercises. Back extensions typically involve some degree of hip extension and spinal extension, and based on our setup and execution, we can bias either of these movements. When we perform back extensions with greater hip movement, we can bias the glutes and hamstrings to a greater magnitude. And when we perform them with greater spinal extension, we can bias the spinal erectors to a greater magnitude. To bias the glutes and hamstrings, we want to set up the hip pad below the hips so that we can achieve maximal hip flexion. In terms of technique, we want to keep the spine in a neutral or even flexed position and avoid extending the spine during the movement. To bias the spinal erectors, we want to set up the hip pad just above the hips so that they can't flex as much. In terms of technique, we want to let the back round as we go down, then actively extend as we come up. However it is performed, the spinal erectors, glutes, and hamstrings will all work to some degree. These setup and technique changes may just allow us to slightly emphasize which muscles are primarily targeted. And the last setup consideration can apply to any rows or vertical pulling exercises, and that is the use of lifting straps. Straps are a simple way to essentially lock your hands to the bar, dumbbell, or attachment, increasing your grip strength. The reason straps can be useful for many back exercises is because your grip strength is what attaches your arms to the piece of equipment. Even though we aren't really trying to train our hand or forearm muscles, they will get fatigued and trained to some extent. And this isn't necessarily an issue. If anything, it's a good thing because it means we don't need to perform direct forearm training. However, it can be problematic if our grip limits our performance before the target muscle of the exercise, which is the back in this case. If our grip gives out before our back muscles, then we are limiting how much we can fatigue our back muscles. So if you find that your grip is limiting your performance of any row or vertical pulling exercise, then straps can be a useful piece of equipment to improve your back training. However, if you find that your grip isn't an issue, then straps probably aren't going to do much to help your training. And finally, let's discuss a few unique programming considerations for back training. There are two unique considerations I can think of relevant for back training. The first is for the use of rows versus vertical pulls in our training program. Essentially, both exercise types are going to train all our back muscles to some extent. However, based on our understanding of anatomy, rows are probably going to bias the upper back a little more, while vertical pulls will bias the lats a little more. In most cases, a well-rounded program should probably include a similar amount of both exercise types for overall back development. However, you can include a greater number of rows or pull-downs in your program based on if you want to specifically emphasize certain regions of the back over others. And the other programming consideration is for the use of back extensions. Or more specifically, are they necessary to include in a training program? Well, they certainly aren't essential. The spinal erectors will be worked to some magnitude during most back exercises, as well as many other exercises which require us to stabilize the spine, such as squat and deadlift variants. For example, this study looked at the trunk muscle activity during various different rows. It was found that the spinal erectors were highly active during these exercises, with free weight rows resulting in the greatest muscle activity. So essentially, the spinal erectors are likely to experience decent growth from regular back training alone. In most cases, you are probably better off spending your time and effort on other exercises that are more overall efficient for back training. However, if you want to maximize their development, some direct training using back extensions is probably necessary. This could be a viable option for those who are already performing a high volume of back training and want to specifically maximize spinal erector growth. It may also be a viable option for those who want to strengthen these muscles for injury prevention or sport performance purposes. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.